Hello, my name is Christine Torres, and I am the Assistant Director for the Pioneer Center for Student Excellence on the Houston campus. Today, we're going to be presenting on the 3 stages of test preparation. So what are the 3 stages? Well, today, what we're going to look at is stage 1, before a test, stage 2, during the test, and stage 3, after the test. Stage 1, before your test. Has anybody heard of backwards planning? Backwards planning is a process where you start with the end goal and then work your way backwards from there to develop a plan of action. Let's suppose hypothetically your exam is on the 10th. We're going to look at our calendar, figure out how much time we have available, and I'll go into the next screen a little bit more detail about that. But what you want to do is realize, okay, if my exam is on the 10th and this is for one class, and I have another exam on the 7th or the 8th or the 9th, there's multiple schedules I need to look at so that you can plan accordingly. Well, how does that planning take place? What you're going to do is you're going to create a study plan. You're going to identify everything that you need to study. This might involve creating a outline of all the material you need to study, looking at a copy of your syllabus for each class. Maybe your instructors have provided you with a review sheet or a blueprint. What you'll do is you'll gather all that information, look at everything that you need to study, and then survey your available time. When you're in the process of serving your available time, it's important to look at all your commitments. If you're a mother, if you are a student, if you are an employee, if you volunteer, we need to look at what those commitments look like on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, and then we need to evaluate our available time. That's the time we're going to use to study. Then we're going to plan out when to study. So if we know that we're off from work on Saturdays, then we need to maximize our Saturdays. It's important that you include self-care. Self-care can be look different on any level, but it's important that you're paying attention to this and that we're also building time for self-care within our study plan. Self-care can look like a bike ride, a walk, coffee with a friend, coffee on your own. When you're doing your readings, to take breaks in between so that you don't feel so pressured to kind of just focus on nothing but school. So this is why it's important to incorporate the self-care, and at all costs, avoid cramming. I have a short video that's going to tell us a little bit more about why it's important to avoid cramming, but this is something that I would stress, right? And we can get there, you can get there if you create this study plan and you start looking at, this is the time I have allotted to study, and then actually sticking to it. So one of the ways that you can prepare for exams or your tests is through a process called spaced repetition. Spaced repetition is a method of reviewing material at systematic intervals. So basically what you're doing is you're taking information that you need to memorize and you're repeating it across several days and several weeks. So if you're in the process of studying for a final exam and you've gone through the planning piece and the backwards planning piece, and you know that you have 4 weeks to study, it's going to help you get through this process of spaced repetition versus if you wait and study 2 days before your exam or 3 days before your exam. So it's important that you utilize spaced repetition in this process. So let's talk about why it's important to use spaced repetition. This is something called the forgetting curve. So I have a short video that's going to explain this.
Welcome to Tiny Medicine. This is my newest series, Studying How to Study. This week, I'm going to explain the basis of spaced repetition by walking you through the forgetting curves. Let's assume you're studying a certain chapter today. The y-axis of the graph represents the memory strength with a maximum value of 100%. When you study the chapter for the first time, you develop a strong memory. Let's call this the primary memory. But with time, memory strength fades rapidly. This is the normal forgetting curve. Now, let's utilize this knowledge to develop powerful study techniques. Here are 2 ways to maximize the retention. The first method is developing a strong primary memory. Imagine two students studying for the same exam. One student by hearts the lessons by cramming, whereas the second student understands the concepts by creating flowcharts. It's obvious that the primary memory of the second student is much stronger than the first student. The key to a strong primary memory is understanding the concepts rather than cramming. Flowcharts are one way to achieve this. There are other techniques like creating tables, mind maps, mnemonics, and pick models. But my favorite technique is creating my own theories. Understanding the concepts before memorizing them is the secret to a strong primary memory. The second secret to a prolonged memory is spaced repetition. When you review the same chapter on the second day, the gradient of the forgetting curve flattens a bit. When you review it again on the seventh day, the slope flattens even further. This pattern of spaced revision is called spaced repetition. It helps to retain facts in memory for longer time periods. You can do this manually by reviewing the notes in a planned timetable. For example, you can review the notes on the second day, on the 7th day, 14th day, 28th day, and then once every 3 months. Or you can use apps developed specifically for this task. Anki is one such popular app used for spaced repetition. To get the notification when I upload a detailed guide on Anki, please subscribe to my channel and press the bell icon.
So that was the short video that helps with understanding the forgetting curve and helps us realize why it's important to use spaced repetition. So if we're trying to cram and you're trying to get all this material in at the last minute, it's going to be very difficult and very stressful. Now, how do we put spaced repetition into practice? First, you start off by reviewing older material first, since it has been some time that maybe you reviewed chapter 1 and now we're on chapter 20. Let's start with reviewing the older material first, because that way it would be easier for us to recall in our long-term memory, because right now the forgetting curve has already taken place with the material you've reviewed on chapter 1. So review your older material first. Try a technique called the Pomodoro technique. The Pomodoro technique is where you set up small periods of time to do your studying, to do your reading. And what it is that you start a timer for 25 minutes. You focus on what you're going to be reading or studying, and you do nothing but that for 25 minutes. You take a 5-minute break, and you repeat this 4 times. You can, after 2 times, maybe take a longer break, like a 15 or 20-minute break, but you want to make sure that those breaks are also timed so that you get back into the routine of sticking to those 25 minutes of focused work. You can create summaries, mnemonics. Mnemonics are an abbreviated way of retaining information. An example of a mnemonic can be something like, my very educated mother just served us noodles. Does anybody know what this mnemonic is for? Has anybody heard this one before? This is actually a way to memorize the planets. So the my very educated mother actually stands for Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars. So each one of the first letters of the sentence we made is actually a way for us to help remember these planets. So if you use mnemonics or picture mnemonics are the same thing, but they can be exaggerated pictures or just pictures that are easy to recall. You can use charts, tables, and checklists. You can also create flashcards. Does anybody currently use flashcards as a process for retaining information or memorizing information? And remember, you can use the reaction buttons. Awesome, somebody does. Somebody likes flashcards. So creating flashcards can also help with that process. So when we're using spaced repetition, like the video said, on day 1 is the initial study session. This is where we're going to try to figure out what we know and what we don't know. The next day, we're going to revisit it. The information that you have been able to retain, you're probably going to move that out to a week. And the information that you're struggling to retain, we're probably going to schedule a time to review that in the next 3 days. And then we're back at the week, and then we're back at the 2 weeks. So this is another important reason why you need to plan out, use backward planning so that you can use spaced repetition as a way to prepare for exams. Another way is a process called active recall. With active recall, this is a process of remembering information. It's a way of moving information from your short-term to your long-term memory so that you can easily recall it when you need it. I have two examples of what active recall is not. So if you've ever been in an exam and you read the question and you go straight to the answers and you identify the answer because you've read it and you've been able to see it, this is not active recall. Because those answers were provided in front of you and because they were right in front of you, you were able to identify what the answer was and not necessarily what you've retained in your memory. Another way that you can tell that active recall is what active recall is not is if you are reading. So if anybody here says, I read, I reread, but I can't get the information, it's because you're not challenging your brain to retain the information. So if you're just reviewing, you're passively reviewing or highlighting your notes and your charts that's immediately in front of you, you're not using your brain to its fullest potential. So how do we put this into practice? How do we put active recall into practice? First, we need to collect the information and understand what we're going to be studying. You can do this two ways. You can use the Cornell note-taking method. This is where you record your information and you reduce it. So this is where we're summarizing, we're reciting it, we're reflecting on it, and we're reviewing it. So the Cornell method is a method for you to be able to summarize your work and identify questions and responses. So it might be a question and an answer response, and helps with that long-term memory process. Another strategy is the SQ3R method. This is where you're maybe going through a chapter and identifying, okay, what do I got to read? Let me identify the headings, the subheadings, any charts that are in the chapter. Let me read it, recite it, review it. So now that we've kind of have an understanding and we've collected the information that we need to review, let's look at some study strategies. You can create mind maps. You can create concept maps. This is a process where you might use a bubble or a box to identify the concept that you're trying to identify, and then draw out different branches to identify, there are five forms of note taking, and these bubbles each represent that, and then you provide more details. You teach what you've learned to someone else with no background or minimal background knowledge of the information you're trying to teach them. So if you have somebody at home that you're able to relay this information and say, hey, here are the points I want to identify when I'm reviewing this theory, or when I'm recalling this lesson or this chapter, check it off and make sure I've gotten it right. As long as the information is not directly in front of you and you're using them to quiz you, that can help. You can create flashcards. Does anybody use apps or any particular apps for flashcards? Maybe Quizlets? So what I have here is another short video that actually shows a different way to create flashcards. So let's look at this really quickly.
Website or online store, make it with Squarespace. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Ali. I'm a junior doctor working in Cambridge. And in this video, I want to talk about how I use Google Sheets as a flashcard alternative for efficient studying. Now, if you've seen any of my previous study videos, you'll know that I love to go on about this thing called active recall, which basically just means testing yourself. It's the single most important efficient study technique ever, and there is a mountain of evidence supporting it. If you haven't heard of it, then please watch my videos. I'll link them up there and down there and stuff. But for this video, I'm going to assume that you know that testing yourself is the single best way of getting really good marks in whatever you do. Now, when it comes to active recall, the most common method is to use flashcards, which makes sense. Flashcards are great, either physical flashcards, which I'm not a fan of, or apps like Anki and Quizlet. But even if you're using all these fancy apps, I still think there are a few drawbacks that flashcards have. Firstly, they take ages to make. Secondly, you end up with like a deck of hundreds, if not thousands of cards. And thirdly, it just becomes a real chore to get through them. And if you're anything like me and you haven't got the discipline to every single day sit down and get through your 300 flashcards, I think they can become a bit of an annoyance rather than a help. So that's where the Google Sheets method comes in. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about exactly how I use Google Sheets as a flashcard alternative. And then later on, I'll talk about why I use Google Sheets as a flashcard alternative and all the various problems with flashcards and, how I think Google Sheets solves that problem. But first, let's just talk about exactly what the method is and how it works. So we're going to jump in and I'm going to show you the Google Sheet that I used to revise for my final year medical school exams at Cambridge a few months ago. and I'll just kind of explain how it works. Okay, so here we have the Google Sheet, and you can see along the bottom, I've got all the various different subjects. So abdomen, cardiovascular examination, the respiratory examination, neuro, endocrine, derm, GALS, which is a musculoskeletal thing. It doesn't matter. The point is the subjects are along the bottom, and then the structure of the sheet is based on having questions in column A and answers in column B. And it's pretty much that simple.
So if you see that in his chart, and this is all I'm going to show you on the video, but if you look at his chart in Excel, he actually uses his column A for the questions. Column B, he wrote them out with his font on black or whatever the ink was, that the color was he used for his font, but he went back and he highlighted them white. So now they disappear. But if you look at the top portion up here, the answers are still there. So it's a way to quiz yourself and you don't have to worry about manually creating flashcards. So I kind of like that as an alternative. So if anybody is using Quizlets or Anki, the one he mentioned as well, here's another alternative to using flashcards, and it's using it through a Excel spreadsheet. You can also study in groups and attend review sessions. If any of you get together or your departments offer this, I strongly encourage you to attend those. And then creating and solving case studies. One of the ways that I love to tell students to kind of pinpoint where they're at with the understanding and taking in information is by using higher order of thinking. And this is Bloom's taxonomy. It's going to be hard to see. Bloom's taxonomy. So the bottom of the triangle, we start off with remembering. So this is where you're understanding what you're reading, what you're reviewing, and then you move up, and the goal is at the top of this pyramid, because the top of the pyramid is where you're tested at. So we want to be sure that once we've gotten to the remembering phase, we're at the understanding phase, we moved up to applying, creating, evaluating, and analyzing. How do we get there? We get there by asking ourselves a series of questions. So whether you're creating test questions, scenarios, or just checking your understanding of where you're at when you're preparing for exams, this is a good way to do that by asking critical thinking questions. So you're going to tap into your critical thinking questions, your critical thinking part of your brain, and you're going to ask yourself questions like this: who, what, when, why, and where. If you can identify that, then you've mastered the remembering phase of Bloom's taxonomy, right? If you keep moving, if you can retell this in your own words, if you can identify how X is related to Y, if you can identify the parts of, and this could be through flashcards, through memorization, through whatever you've retained, then you know you've gotten closer to understanding and retaining the information versus just memorizing it on your short-term memory. So these are some key questions I like to tell students to use when you kind of feel stuck with, okay, I'm just not retaining this information. I've read it over and over. But there's a lot of key questions that you can ask yourself. And I feel that this is a good example of just some words to help trigger your memory and start training your brain to think critically. You can use words like appraise, decide, formulate, generate, debate. If you can have these conversations and through your conversations with your peers or the questions that you ask yourself, if you ask them from a standpoint of critical thinking, this is going to help you retain the information. So now let's look at before the exam. So before the exam, we're still in this process, right, of these stages. You want to be sure that you eat well, that you get enough sleep, that you arrive early, that you avoid excessive caffeine cramming, that you avoid anxious classmates. And if you're that person that tends to come around your peers and just, you're nervous and you express that, please don't do that, because you're going to create more anxiety on yourself and on them. And avoid negative self-talk. Remember, if you believe you can, you're halfway there. Okay, so it all starts with you. So that negative self-talk, we need to kind of change that behavior and think more positively about ourselves and what we can accomplish. So now we're at stage 2, during the exam. So during the exam, if you start to feel maybe some sweating, some heart palpitations, if you start feeling like everything's just overwhelming, please tell yourself that it's going to be okay. You have to be that person that's going to advocate for yourself in this test environment and let yourself know, okay, I'm getting to the point to where I'm starting to feel anxious. I need to calm myself down. I've studied. I did all that I could. I'm here to take the test now, and I'm going to make the best of this situation. You want to focus on answering the questions. So you also want to work methodically. If you tend to rush, then you want to slow down. If you tend to run out of time, you want to pace yourself. If you tend to get anxious, practice time testing. So if you are still trying to get comfortable with a timed test and you want to practice that, when you're going through the Pomodoro technique, if you set goals and say in 25 minutes, I'm going to do this and that alarm rings, you're going to be more prepared to get that information done within those 25 minutes, just like you will on your exam. So practice that. You also want to be sure that you are thinking critically. I have another short question here for you, and it's actually a good example of how to think critically when you're in a test environment. So let's look at this real quick. So if anybody I've previously worked with,
here's a brain teaser,
has done this before, please hold your answers, but I'm going to ask everybody to drop your answer in the chat box, okay? So it's a brain teaser. Let me start over.
Here's a brain teaser. A rooster is on the roof of a barn facing east. The wind is blowing to the west at 10 miles per hour. The rooster lays an egg. Which direction does the egg roll? If you want, you can pause the...
Okay, so does anybody need me to repeat it, or are you ready to put your answer in the chat box? Does anybody need me to repeat it? So the question is, which way does the egg roll? Awesome. I had somebody answer it. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Correct. Roosters don't lay eggs. So if you're sitting here trying to distinguish, does it roll east? Does it roll west? Yeah. If you're trying to distinguish this is not critical thinking, right? So what we want to make sure that we're doing is
video and think it over
quickly, critically on an exam. So ask yourself, what are the key details? Am I being misled in any way? Could I be thinking about this another way? So with the brain teaser that I just gave you as an example for thinking critically, ask yourself, what's the significant information here? Is it where the rooster's sitting? Is it the fact that it is a rooster? Or is it the fact that it's on a roof and the roof is slanted? Think about these things when you answer your questions on test day. This will actually help you to perform better and not jumping to conclusions, because the rooster laying an egg and the egg lying west might be your first response. So it might be there to mislead you. So above all, just do your best on your exams. What we're here to do is to kind of test your knowledge. So if you use these kind of things that we've talked about today, you can get to that point and then do your best. After the exam, it's important that after the exam, you relax, you decompress and rest your brain. Hopefully we have not been doing too much cramming, or at least gotten better with the amount of information we're cramming. Analyze your performance. Think about what you weren't able to answer or what you weren't completely able to answer. Write it down. Think about, well, what strategies? This is the reflection part. What strategies helped me? Would I do anything differently? What campus resources can I use? And create an action plan for future exams. So if you stop and think, my last exam, whether that be your midterm, last semester, or a previous exam, think about, what did I do? Did it help me? Is there anything I can change about that? Maybe you didn't allow yourself enough time. Backwards planning. Maybe you didn't use flashcards to help with that, moving that information from short-term to long-term memory. Think about what strategies you can use to get to that point where you want to be on these upcoming exams. Maybe there are campus services that you had not reached out to before. I am an academic coach. I'm on the Houston campus, but we do have coaches on other campus, and we do work virtually with our students. So maybe you need to meet with an academic coach to work with somebody to help you work smarter, not harder. Maybe you need to reach out to disability service, our CAP service, our TRIO services. There's an array of services and resources available to all of our students. But start thinking about what that's going to look like, and then make a commitment, make an action plan to say, this is what I'm going to do moving forward. And celebrate. The exam's over. Good job. Let's figure out what we need to do to continue this momentum. So my name is Christine Torres again. I am the Assistant Director in the Pioneer Center for Student Excellence. I do have my contact information on the screen. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing. We're still recording. But what I want to do is open the floor for anybody who might want to ask any questions or want me to go back and review any of the information that I talked about today, or if anybody has any comments. Feel free to take yourself off of mute or go ahead and drop something in the chat box. If you want to send me a private message to ask, I am definitely open to that. You would just go down to the chat box and click on my name, and I can read your question out loud. Right, well, if we do not have any questions, I am prepared to end the recording. So give me a second.